Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of The Democratic View, and my name is Phyllis Italiano. I'm the hostess, and I have with me today a man who I have been dying to have back again because I think that this guy really knows a lot about the most important issue facing us right now, which is the water we drink. And his name is Bob DeLuca, and he is the executive director, am I correct?
President, executive director, same thing.
Whatever, of the group of the East End. And welcome to you, and I'm going to go right on. First of all, are you from Long Island?
No, I moved to Long Island in 1984.
From?
Well, I was actually in school, but before, I'm originally from Connecticut, and then I was in school in Syracuse. And after I got out of school, Carl Grossman, who many people out here may know, had come, and he was a guest lecturer when I was in grad school. Yes. And I connected up with him, and I originally started at then Group for the South Fork, now Group for the East End, right out of grad school back in the mid-'80s. But I left and then came back again in the early 90s. I couldn't get enough, so.
Yeah, well, I understand. Me too. I mean, I'm from the Bronx, but I choose to be here because from May till the end of October, I wake up, brush my teeth, get on my bathing suit, and jump in the water. And I love my bay.
Absolutely.
I love that bay. And I want to see that bay remain as, well, pristine as it appears to be to me right now. I know it isn't, but I know that from my shoulders to my feet on a calm day, I can see my toenail polish. So I would like to believe that that can continue, but I know we have a lot of problems. Yep. And I'd like you to start to tell us what we need to do and what our problems are.
Okay. Well, the first thing, of course, I didn't know you were from the Bronx. I went to Fordham, so you've had that.
Oh, well, I'm not far from Fordham, as a matter of fact.
Did a little bit of work in the Bronx River back in the day. So,
yes.
But in any case, water, of course, is essential to every human civilization. It's obviously, 60, 70% of our bodies are water. We need water in many ways. But it's also a resource that is very easy to kind of take for granted. Many of us in this part of the world, we get up, we have a faucet, water comes out of the faucet, we drink the water, we bathe in the water, we go out in the bays and harbors and they look beautiful. And there's not a lot of attention paid to how all of this sort of comes to be. So one of the things that we know now that we didn't know maybe 50 or 60 years ago is that our drinking water here on Long Island, unlike many other places, there's no surface water reservoir anyplace. There's no big reservoir that you can put a fence around and protect. It's all coming from underneath the ground, which means that everything that we do on top of the ground filters down through the sand and the gravel and the soil and gets down to what we call an aquifer, which is really just a saturated area of soil beneath our feet. And then, like sticking a straw into that soil, we pull up water for private wells, or public supply wells. It's all coming from that aquifer system. And depending on the quality of that water, we get out of the tap essentially what's down there. So unlike a reservoir system that many people are familiar with, where you could say, we're going to have thousands of acres around that reservoir protected and fences and everything else, we're all walking on it, driving on it. And so there's a lot of concern about how we take care of the water down beneath our feet. And that's been something that the town of East Hampton has been a leader on historically in terms of trying to look at that aspect of water quality. But we now know more about the relationship between the water beneath our feet and how that water moves through that aquifer system and then comes up in our surface waters, so in our bays and in our harbors and in the Sound. And we're finding more recently that what that water carries with it can have a significant and negative effect on coastal ecosystems. And what that really means is it's harder to get fish, it's harder to get clams. We have less eelgrass. With less eelgrass, we have less nursery grounds for finfish and shellfish. And a part of the problem, not the only problem, but a part of that problem, which we're finding out more, has to do with our own septic systems. So when you flush that toilet, water is also going out of your house. And for most people living on the East End, not everybody, there are a few sewage treatment systems. It's going down into the ground, it's going out into your backyard, and it's finding its way down into the aquifer. The nitrogen that comes out of all of us, once it gets below the root zone, stays in that groundwater, finds its way into surface waters, and in a sense, you're fertilized, as many people know, nitrogen is a nutrient. So you're kind of fertilizing the bay with the nitrogen, which may sound like a good thing, and the bay can handle some nitrogen, but too much nitrogen sets that system out of balance. And so if you look since the mid-1980s as an example, we're seeing more and more increases in evidence that the bays are declining, and part of that decline relates to too much nitrogen getting into the water. So that water is over-fertilized. That over-fertilization creates things that we call harmful algae blooms, which brown tides, red tides, rust tides, all sorts of different tides, microscopic plants, and those microscopic plants have a variety of impacts on coastal ecosystems, right? So some may just cloud out the water, so your finfish move out because they can't find smaller fish to eat, or plants may die because they can't get sunlight through the water. Others, like the red tide, that organism actually creates a toxin, and that toxin can accumulate in shellfish, and if you or I were to eat that toxin in large concentrations, we could get very sick, and in fact, you could die from that. So our resource managers are very careful about saying, if you find red tide, close the shellfish bed, we're not going in there for a while. So these things are starting to accumulate. We have if you look at the uptick in the number of harmful algae blooms as one indicator, that number continues to go up. Eelgrass, which is another staple of marine ecosystems here, those numbers go down. Less eelgrass beds, less baby shellfish, less mature shellfish, so we have that problem. Finfish, obviously, also, if they can't see their prey, it's not a good place for them to, to find something to eat, so they start to move on. So we have a lot of these things accumulating. Now, what do you do about all that? As people say, great, so tell me some more bad news.
Yeah.
Well, in our business, and I think anybody in this business, and people may not understand this, we believe that we're here to find solutions to these problems. We're not here to just come and tell you that the sky is falling and move on and make you feel bad. One of the things that's great about the East End is that if you take a look at the way that local governments and the community members that live here have acted to protect land, really to protect, historic structures, many things that we do here don't get done in other places. So when it comes to water, this region is as aware of water as maybe any other region that I've been to. So that's good. That's a good starting place. What we don't have right now are essentially the right rules in place to try to protect the surface waters from the nitrogen which is getting in there. We also don't have infrastructure that we probably should have been thinking about over the last 30 or 40 years. We think about bridges, we think about tunnels, we think about roads, but waste management, what we do with our sewage and sewage pollution, that's also infrastructure. We haven't managed for that. So let's talk a little bit about that. Town of East Hampton recently made a decision last year to go forward with a wastewater management plan for the town. We think that's a great idea because it starts to give you a baseline understanding of how many septic systems are we talking about? How old are those systems? Now, for a period of time, I worked at the Suffolk County Health Department, which is largely responsible for putting these systems in and so forth and monitoring the groundwater. We know that the East End has the largest concentration of septic systems across the East End. We have a ton of these things. In many places up west, there actually are sewer districts, but out east we have a lot of these systems. Many of these systems may be 40, 50, 60, 100 years old. You go to a place like Orient, who knows where that's going.
Right.
So as long as it keeps going down the pipe, most of us, me included, don't think much about it. And people often think of maintaining a septic system means when it backs up into your house, you get somebody to pump it out. But believe it or not, those systems are supposed to be maintained on a regular basis. Most of us don't do that. So the systems that we do have are in various states of decline or disrepair, and some of them, and if you talk to some of the cesspool vendors, Norsec and those kinds of companies, they'll tell you that some of these old systems are actually collapsing in, and people wake up one morning and there's a giant hole in their backyard. So there's sort of regular safety issues associated with that. We're trying to find a way to re-engineer the way that we manage wastewater on the East End. And I would say that that is not an impossible thing to do. And I would say it's a very tangible thing to do in the same way that we no longer dump all of our garbage into an open hole because we found out that that garbage was leaking into this underground drinking water resource that we have. So this is also true with respect to our septic systems. So the town of East Hampton, just looking at East Hampton, is on the right track. They basically said, look, we have to get a handle on this issue. The other thing which they're interested in is what do we do with the scavenger waste plant that we have,
Right.
which, by the way, is a valuable piece of infrastructure. I mean, that
Right.
actually is infrastructure, and it has value, and it could have more value. You have to figure out, what would you have to do to kind of get it back up and running, but I think that's an important part of this analysis. And one of the things that we're working on, a group for the East End is working with partners across Long Island Pine Barren Society,
Yes.
Citizens Campaign for the Environment, Nature Conservancy, us, and many other smaller organizations, regional organizations, neighborhood organizations, on something we call the the Clean Water Partnership. And that Clean Water Partnership is essentially asking the state of New York to get involved in this effort as well, so that it's not just left to the town of East Hampton with limited resources. We want the state of New York to help us in a couple of ways. We want the state of New York essentially to focus its energy on a clean water action plan for Long Island, of which the East End would be a part, and of which the East Hampton wastewater management plan would be a further part. We want to see the state of New York make a conscious investment in the infrastructure that we may need to help set in motion this change. And we also think that it's critical that we have an action plan that we can look at over time and see if we're getting anywhere. Because one of the issues that we run up against is each individual town may have a specific problem here or something over there. We're not looking at this in a comprehensive way. We're really not. And we don't have any goals that are set to know, how much septic waste should we be taking out of the groundwater to get that bay to be clean? What's the number? We also live in an area where, on the North Fork, there's a contribution to the Peconic Bay, let's say, and on the South Fork, there's a contribution to the Peconic Bay. How do we link up those towns to figure out what their septic contribution is, what the nitrogen contribution is, and set some goals? So in conjunction with local efforts like we have here, starting now in East Hampton on this, which is great, we're also working hard to have the state of New York say, look, this region, we're the Adirondack Park of Long Island and the metropolitan New York area. People come out here for all of the things that you described.
Oh, absolutely.
Boating, fishing, swimming. If you took a look at the, sales tax receipts from people who stay in Montauk and people who eat fish dinners and everything else, it's a huge economic component to the entire region, but it's also a great recreational component to this region. And we're bringing that message this Tuesday. My colleagues and I will be up in Albany, and we'll be meeting with Senator Laval and Assemblyman Sweeney and other representatives of the Long Island delegation to talk about this issue. And I'm very happy to report that Senator Laval and Assemblyman Bob Sweeney, and with the input of our very own, Assemblyman Fred Thiel, are all working on this issue and are starting to draft a bill that might be able to help us in this process to figure out how do we get a plan, how do we get funding, and how do we get the rules in the right place to make sure that we're not continuing to approve septic systems that are going to kill our bays and harbors 10 years from now.
See, that's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for somebody to say to me, here's what you need to do, with that, whatever's out in the backyard there, so that you are not going to continue to feel guilty every time you flush the toilet.
Right. And we have to help people because you have a
That's right.
system in your house, you have, the average person is not a sanitary engineer, nor should they be.
My house was built in 1967. I'm sure that whatever it is back there is
But you probably have a block cesspool, which is, basically cinder blocks. There's a pipe that comes out of your house and.
That's right, that's right. I'm sure that's what it is.
It's Roman technology, right? So we would like to kind of bring us along at least into the 20th or 21st
Absolutely.
century. And no one thinks that this is going to happen overnight. It's a big issue. We take it very seriously, and we understand the economic implications, and we want to work just as hard on the economic side to have the state of New York helping us, as well as the local level, to find funding mechanisms that we'll need depending on which part of this we want to go after. So
Yes.
having been through a number of these endeavors, whether it was the Community Preservation Fund or the Pine Barrens Protection Act or the Peconic Estuary Program, if there's any benefit of aging in this kind of work, it's one of the things, you start to figure out all the component parts that you need for a successful program, and you make sure you start talking about them at the beginning. So I would hope that people could take some hope away from that and feel like that we could get a plan here and we could get something going in East Hampton, as East Hampton has been known for decades, being out in front. And one thing I do want to say is
That's why I live in East Hampton.
Because
they had that reputation.
And well-deserved and well-earned. Now, we've been in a period, and it's been a tough economic time, and East Hampton is not alone in this, where many of the environmental things that we used to sort of take for granted have really slipped to the wayside because people were, there's all kinds of things going on in terms of financial things and political things and everything else. So we have a new day in East Hampton. We have a new town board. The new town board is like everybody else, ready to go. It's a new year. And one of the things that we've been doing that I hope folks will also look for is, we've been working with a coalition of other East Hampton organizations, this East Hampton Environmental Coalition. And I think that's a very valuable way for all of the various organizations and entities that are working on environmental issues to try to consolidate what we're looking for and provide that to the town board as a framework for them to say, okay, so if you're a group for the East End, this is what you're looking at. Concerned Citizens of Montauk agrees with you on that. And we have, other folks, Northwest Alliance is looking at this, Acabonic Protection Committee. And we actually put this together. There is something that you can find, this East Hampton Green Guide.
Yeah.
And that helps to outline what we think the board might want to focus on in terms of all of our collective interests. And we hope that that will improve the efficiency with which they can go after these things, because they say, okay, you guys all got together, you thought about all this stuff,
Oh, yes.
and that makes it a little bit easier as opposed to saying, hey, what should we do next week?
Well, first of all, I am well aware of the fact that water is the gold and the oil of the future in the whole world. That's going to be the most important thing that we're going to have to deal with. So that this town is now on a path of really considering how we can maintain our aquifer. I was telling you before we started that there was a show on LTV, which I watch all the time, and people were asked, where does our water come from? And there was no one who came up with the right. They all were saying things like, well, my faucet, well, I have a well in the front,
Right.
but nobody knew,
No.
Where water came from.
And it speaks to a real need in the busy, complicated world that we live in. It's tough to kind of think about that, right? You walk in the house, there's a million things going on. You go to the faucet, you expect it to produce clean water. But, if you have a well, did you have that well tested? How long ago did you have it tested? Who do you talk to about having it tested? Our Suffolk County Health Department here actually has a very good well testing program, but obviously you have to look them up and make a phone call
Right.
and get them in. And all of those pieces, we need help, and we need more effort. My organization and all the other organizations that are out here working on these things attempt to get that message out there. We got to do more, because what we're seeing, and I think one of the, if there's ever a bright lining to problems, is that more people than the sort of, than the choir are paying attention. And now we know that our elected officials see this as a very serious issue. And when that's happened before, when land was being gobbled up here at an unprecedented pace, the Community Preservation Fund, people may not realize this, there was about a decade of discussion that preceded that effort at the state level. Everybody started to see the uptick in development, started to see land going, what are we going to do about it, a lot of thinking. And then it was, and I remember, there was like this one day when it just seemed like every single piece of land was coming in and getting whacked up faster than anybody ever imagined. And suddenly people well beyond the environmental community said, what is this place going to look like? What is the region going to look like? What's the bread and butter of having a rural area that supports farming and fishing and tourism going to look like if the whole thing gets totally developed? And that was the genesis for that particular initiative, to move beyond a smaller circle of people who were looking at these things more closely to, an effort that had several hundred members of a coalition, including builders, including real estate people, and government officials, saying, we got to do something here. And that, we've saved, 10,000, 12,000, maybe more acres with that program. It's generated close to $1 billion of revenue for land protection, and it may well prove to be one of the best investments that was ever made across the region, because we will have that land. And one of the other things that we should probably mention is that underneath that land
Yes.
is water.
That's right.
And
That's
if
right.
there's no development on top, that means that we get clean water coming in, and that clean water helps to dilute the less clean water that may be surrounding it. That's important in terms of an overall clean water strategy. Land protection, and again, it's the kind of thing where you have to think about it to connect the dots, but the land protection that we do is also an investment in clean water protection. The more land that we have protecting our aquifer, we think of watersheds as trying to sort of protect, a lake of water in the middle surrounded by a watershed, and that's a buffer that you can visualize. We have the water underneath us. And so that ground on top is our buffer. And the more of those buffers we can put in from every developed piece of property to every piece of open land that's protected, those are all little investments in clean water down the road that eventually gets into those bays and harbors. So these pieces all circle back around. Everything is connected in the environmental world, and the more pieces of the puzzle that you're paying attention to, the better off you are long-term in having a sustainable plan that I guarantee will cost you less than somebody says, oh, it's all polluted now. Now we have to make some massive investment in God knows what kind of technology to clean the whole thing up.
Oh, my God. I mean, and is that even possible?
Right. Well, that's true, too. Once things get to a certain point.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, at some point, people lose the will, and they say, okay, well, we're just kind of,
I'm out of here.
yeah, I did the best we could, good luck to the next guy, and we never want to see that happen. And I believe, and having worked out here for God knows how many years on this, we don't have that kind of energy in this region. In this region, people show up. I mean, I still remember when the first brown tide in 1985 showed up in the Peconic Bay estuary, and
I remember it too.
and there were two older women that walked into our office, one from the North Fork and one from the South Fork, and they said, "What are you guys doing about this?" And we were like, "Oh," and we started looking, and sure enough, those two ladies and the energy that they brought created the first $200,000 investment by Suffolk County to start studying this brown tide. That investment turned into the nomination document to get the Peconic Estuary into the estuary program.
Right.
And millions of dollars have flowed into research and investment to try to clean up the estuary, just from a couple of people who said, hey, wait a minute, we're not just going to sit by and not figure out what's going on here. So we've had great examples of that, and I'm always hopeful that that energy overcomes just about every obstacle that's put in front of us. And I think out here, there's plenty of evidence where it has.
I just have to, as you were talking about, I remember I've been coming out to Fire Island for 1961, and I can remember the scallops dancing in the water, the shallow water with the eelgrass around, and they would just kind of dance along, and you would see them, and then came the brown tide,
Yep.
and that brown tide really was shocking. And
Yep.
this is Great South Bay.
Right. It essentially, I mean, within a period of a couple of years, and looking at the Peconics in particular, you essentially eliminated an entire industry over the course of a couple of years, and we've been trying to build it back in many ways ever since. That's how quickly you can lose it. Multi-million-dollar industry in terms of scalloping on the East End, and it was gone. And the guys who were in that business, what do? So we have to think about that. We have to think about, it's not always a progression of it gets a little bit worse, it gets a little bit worse, it gets a little bit worse.
Right.
Sometimes it gets a little bit worse, and then boom,
Yes.
you go off the cliff, and you may not even know why. And we're still trying to figure out exactly all the component parts that are important in the future of the health of the bay. But what we do know is that the longer that you wait, the more time goes by, the worse things get, the harder it is to bring things back. So I think what's important for everybody to think about is we've got an opportunity to get moving on these things. Clean water is a huge priority for the region, and we have substantial
I think
evidence.
it's the
that
first priority. I really do.
well, many other things relate to it, right? So the health of that water, no matter what your perspective is, whether you're looking at the value of a coastal property or you're looking at the scallop that lives in that bay and how that could help somebody who's a bayman, make a living, that clean water is essential to everybody, kayakers and
Absolutely.
recreational boaters.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think, again, the good news is with that level of interest, there's a pretty good chance that we can solve these problems.
And do you think that there will be, for instance, if I were to invest in something that would be really efficient as far as the nitrogen coming into my septic system, that there will be some kind of tax thing along
Well, one of
that?
the things that we're hoping for in this initiative at the state level would be to say, how do you, it's like, how do you transition cars into, seat belts and airbags and hybrids and all these other things?
Right.
Incentives are a huge part of that. So how do we create incentives to get the technology?
I
that
have
we
solar
need?
panels,
Okay.
and I drive a Prius,
Right.
so I'm very interested in that kind of stuff. Now I want to start,
Right.
considering how I'm going to effectively change the system I have.
And I think one of the important elements of the town's effort in its wastewater plan is to let us know where are the most critical areas to focus our attention, right? Because you're going to have areas that are absolutely critical for attention yesterday. And you're going to have other areas that may not need, and you need to know that. You need to know some of that going in so that when you have limited resources, you can deploy them where they're going to do the greatest amount of good. I mean, one of the things, Suffolk County, as you may know, has like every 15 years, they have a comprehensive water resources analysis of how we're doing. Now, the bad news is we have a steady decline in water quality, but the good news is some of the research and some of the modeling that they do, a vast number of the areas that are in trouble, the contributing area of groundwater could change within a couple of years. If you were to change the nitrogen going in other words, you don't have to wait 100 years for this to happen. If you were to prioritize the areas where you have significant nitrogen contribution, and that nitrogen contribution is getting into those waterways in a very short period of time, then if you start changing the technology in those areas, you will get the benefits in a fairly short period of time. And that's always important, because in order to retain political interest and public will, people want to see change, right? So we have to get it.
So how do I find out if my area is part of that?
Well, one of the things that I believe is going to come out of this study, and I've met with the consultant, Pio Lombardo, and spoken with him. He's a talented guy, he does this kind of thing.
I know.
And part of his job is to tell us, okay, here's the whole town of East Hampton. These are the various watersheds in East Hampton town. These are the watersheds that are most at risk, and why. And if we're going to invest in the future, where do we start? And I would hope that would be a baseline goal of that study.
Well, I can't wait till that. When is he going to let us know?
Well, I think he's starting very soon, right? He was ready to, I think the end of December or beginning of January, he was ready to set up sort of community meetings on this.
Great.
And that will be our first, and we'll be there, and I'm sure others will be too.
Oh, we'll all be there. We'll all be in that audience waiting to hear what he has to tell us, because this is, I believe, the key issue. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're always so informative to us. I mean,
Very kind.
it's a wonderful, we've got to work on this.